know why I rented the cabin. Maybe I just needed space. City life had drained me, and I wanted to be alone. Just for a while. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just silence. I found the place online, a remote cabin deep in Black Hollow Forest, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. No electricity, no running water, just a wooden structure with a fireplace and a well nearby for fresh water. The owner told me no one lived within 10 miles. That was fine by me. I packed light, a rifle, a few days' worth of food, a flashlight, and a satellite phone in case of emergencies. I didn't plan on using it. I just wanted peace. I got something else instead. The last stretch of the drive was nothing but narrow dirt roads twisting through thick forest. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches clawing at my truck as I crawled forward. No signs, no houses, just trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the hills. It was smaller than I expected. A simple one-room structure with a slanted tin roof, a small porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A woodpile sat near the front steps, freshly chopped. That struck me as odd. The listing had said the cabin hadn't been rented in over a year. I shook off the unease and unloaded my gear. The air inside was stale and cold. Dust coated the wooden floorboards, except for a single set of footprints leading from the door to the fireplace. I hesitated, staring at them. They weren't mine. I glanced around. A bed in the corner, a small table, an old rocking chair near the fireplace. Everything else was covered in dust. I walked to the footprints, rifle in hand. They were faint, like someone had stepped in with damp boots a long time ago. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe the owner had come by to check on the place. Still, I made sure the door was locked before I went to bed. I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, almost like breathing, just beyond the window. I held my breath, listening. Then soft footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, not boots, bare feet. My heart pounded. I reached for my rifle, my fingers sweaty against the cold metal. The steps stopped. Silence. I stayed awake until dawn. Morning came and I forced myself outside. The porch was empty. No footprints. No sign of anyone. But as I walked around the back of the cabin, my stomach dropped. Tracks. Barefoot. Leading from the trees to the cabin. And back again. Who the hell walks around a forest barefoot in the middle of the night? I stared at the tree line, gripping my rifle. Nothing moved. I should have left then. I didn't. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked at the tree line, I swore I saw something shift between the trunks. By noon, I was low on water. The well was about 50 yards from the cabin, covered by an old wooden lid. I walked over, bucket in hand, and pulled the lid open. Something was inside. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves caught at the bottom. Then I saw the fingers, pale, curled, barely visible beneath the shadows. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Then movement. The fingers twitched. I ran. I barricaded the door, chair under the handle, rifle on my lap. The fire burned low as I sat in silence, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke to a soft creaking sound. My heart stopped. The rocking chair, it was moving, just slightly, back and forth. And in the dim glow of the fire, I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner of the room, pale, thin, watching me. I raised my rifle, smiled, and then it ran at me. I fired once, the sound deafening in the small cabin. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the figure was gone, the door wide open, swinging in the wind. I ran to my truck, heart hammering, barely pausing to grab my keys. The engine roared to life, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the trail. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, standing in the tree line, watching, smiling, barefoot. I never went back. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert, swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust. The kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me, but I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break. But by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough. The branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again, a sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind, but something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few hundred miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's going to go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark, the soft hum of the engine, the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead, red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured, not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty. The only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the roads still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. I don't know why I thought this trip was a good idea. At first, it had seemed perfect. A full week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the mountains. No emails, no phone calls, no city noise. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. I had found the cabin through a rental site. It was listed as off-grid, miles from the nearest paved road, with no electricity and no cell service. The pictures showed a sturdy little wooden structure nestled between thick pine trees, with a creek running nearby. The description said it was perfect for people looking to disconnect. I had jumped at the chance. The drive was brutal. The first few hours were easy, long highways, winding country roads. But then the real challenge started. The last stretch was 30 miles of dirt roads, getting rougher with every mile. The further I went, the less it felt like anyone had driven here in a long time. I kept checking the directions I had printed out. The last landmark was an old fire watchtower, long abandoned. Once I passed that, it was another 5 miles down a barely visible trail. By the time I reached the cabin, my truck was covered in dust. My arms were sore from gripping the wheel, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place looked almost exactly like the pictures. Small, sturdy, weathered. The roof was a little more rusted than I expected, and the porch sagged slightly, but it looked safe enough. Inside, it was simple. One big main room with a fireplace and a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom with an old hand pump sink. There were lanterns for light, a wood-burning stove for heat, and a well out back for water. No electricity, no service, just me and the wilderness. That first night, I made a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the silence. It was strange how quiet it was. No cars, no distant voices, not even the hum of an airplane overhead, just the wind in the trees. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold. I sat up, rubbing my face, trying to shake off the grogginess. Then I heard it, a noise outside, not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the dirt, right outside the cabin. I held my breath. The steps moved from the side of the cabin to the porch. Then silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe a branch falling, or the creaking of old wood settling. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then I went outside and saw the footprints. They circled the cabin. Human footprints, barefoot. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. The dirt was dry, and the prints were deep. Whoever had been out here had stood in place for a long time. Watching, I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just endless forest. I thought about leaving, but I had driven for hours to get here, and part of me felt stupid for being so shaken. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe someone passing through. I decided to stay. That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I sat by the fire, forcing myself to focus on a book. I didn't want to think about the footprints, but as the night dragged on, I started to feel it again. That creeping, suffocating sense of being watched. I told myself I was imagining it, that my brain was playing tricks on me. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft tap, like a fingertip brushing against the glass of the window. I froze. The tap came again, a little louder. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering. The window was covered in darkness, the lantern light reflecting off the glass. I couldn't see anything outside. Then the tapping moved, from one window to the next. Slow, testing. I grabbed the rifle with shaky hands and backed toward the fireplace. My breath was coming too fast, too shallow. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up my gear, threw everything into my truck, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. I popped the hood, checked the battery. Everything looked fine. But no matter what I tried, the truck was dead. A chill crawled up my spine. Then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, just watching. I gripped the rifle tight, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stood there before my legs finally worked again. I grabbed my bag and started walking, fast. I followed the dirt road, heading for the fire watchtower I had passed on my way in. It was my best chance of finding someone, anyone. I walked for hours. The sun burned hot overhead, sweat dripping down my back. My feet ached. Then the smell hit me, rotten, wet, like something dead had been left out for too long. And that's when I saw it, a second cabin. I hadn't seen it on my way in. It was smaller than mine, half hidden by thick trees. Something was wrong with it. The door was open, hanging slightly off its hinges. The windows were shattered. And the smell, it was coming from inside. I should have kept walking, but something drew me forward. I stepped inside, and I saw the pile. Clothes, shoes, backpacks, all stacked neatly, as if someone had been collecting them. And then I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the trees. Slow, deliberate, coming straight for me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just ran. The footsteps followed. Fast, heavy. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, vision blurring. Then, just as I reached the fire watchtower, I saw a truck. I didn't stop. I threw myself at it, pounded on the window. The driver was an older man. His eyes went wide when he saw me. I barely got the words out before he threw the door open and pulled me inside. We sped off down the road, kicking up dust. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still standing there. I never went back, never told the owner what I had seen. I don't know how many people had rented that cabin before me, or how many hadn't left. But sometimes late at night I wonder, what would have happened if my truck had started that morning? I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Life in the city had been suffocating me. Too much noise, too many people, too much stress. I needed a break, a real one. So I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. It was isolated, miles away from the nearest town. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, just me, the trees, and silence. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long, over 6 hours from where I lived. The last hour was rough. Nothing but winding dirt roads that hadn't been maintained in years. My truck bounced over deep ruts, dust rising behind me. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a porch, and a fire pit out front. The surrounding trees were thick, stretching high into the sky, cutting off most of the sunlight. I stepped out of the truck and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Silence. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of a plane overhead. Just the wind through the trees. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The cabin was simple. A single main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was old but sturdy. I lit a few lanterns, set down my things, and sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. That's when I first saw him. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I was looking out at the trees, watching the last light fade, when I noticed something. A figure, far off, standing just inside the treeline. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I could tell it was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the shadows, maybe a tree that just happened to look like a person from the right angle. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself to forget about it. But that night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up sometime after midnight. It was dark. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps moved slowly, circling the cabin. Not hurried, not random, just a slow, steady pacing. I reached for the rifle I had brought with me, gripping it tight. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, I must have drifted into a restless sleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I sat up, my muscles aching from how tense I had been. Had I imagined it? I forced myself to check outside. There were footprints in the dirt, deep, clear boot prints circling the cabin. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a hiker, maybe some drunk guy from town who got lost. I spent the day exploring the woods near the cabin, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The forest felt off, too quiet. I kept getting this feeling like I was being watched. That night, I locked the doors and windows, loaded my rifle, and sat by the fire, determined to stay awake. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Breathing, not my own, right outside the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I grabbed my rifle, heart hammering. Then the door handle moved. Not shaking, not jerking, just a slow, testing turn. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then silence. The breathing stopped. The handle went still. I sat there, gun raised, until the sun came up. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up my things, threw them in the truck, and jumped in the driver's seat. I turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. I tried again. The truck wouldn't start. My stomach sank. I popped the hood, checking the battery, the cables. Everything looked fine, but the truck wouldn't start. Then, from the corner of my eye, movement. I turned my head, and he was there, standing at the edge of the trees, closer than before. I could see him clearly now. Tall, thin, wearing old, dark clothes. His face was wrong. Something about the proportions, the way his head tilted slightly to the side. He wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't think. I grabbed my rifle, aimed it at him. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't run, just kept watching. My hands were shaking. My breath came fast and uneven. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too unnatural. Something inside me broke. I bolted. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and ran. Into the woods, away from the cabin. Branches slashed at my arms. My breath burned in my throat. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed near an old dirt road. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard an engine. A truck. An older man pulled over, eyes wide as he took me in. I must have looked insane. Dirty, shaking, wide-eyed with fear. I barely managed to tell him what happened. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, told me to get in. As we drove away, I looked back. The cabin was barely visible through the trees. But I swear to God, I saw him, standing in the same spot, still watching, and still smiling. I never went back, never told the owner what happened. I don't even know if the cabin is still there. I don't care. I moved to a city, surrounded myself with people, with noise, with light. But sometimes, at night, when everything is quiet, I get this feeling, like I should never have left that place alive. I always camped alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked it that way. No distractions, no small talk, just me and the woods. It was the one place where I didn't have to think about anything except the next fire, the next meal, the next morning. I had taken dozens of solo trips over the years, but this one was going to be the deepest I had ever gone. I had spent weeks planning it, tracing routes on the map, marking out possible sites. No trails, no roads, just deep forest and the promise of silence. I told myself this would be the trip I remembered for the rest of my life. I wasn't wrong. I left before sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a hatchet, my rifle. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 miles on a rough dirt road that felt like it hadn't been maintained in years. When I finally reached the spot where I had to leave my truck, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the tree line, feeling the weight of the isolation ahead. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the ground was clear, the kind of place where you could feel the silence settle in your bones. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek, set down my pack, and took a long drink from my canteen. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only movement was the water and the occasional bird flitting through the branches. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rock face on one side. The kind of place where I could sit with my back against the stone, looking out at the woods, knowing nothing could come at me from behind. I set up my tent near the rock wall, cleared out a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a meal out of a vacuum-sealed bag, watching the flames flicker. That was the last normal moment of the trip. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just thick, suffocating stillness. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere just beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, another footstep. Closer. I sat up slowly, gripping the rifle, my eyes scanning the darkness. My fire had burned too low to see far, just enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The eye strained my ears. Silence. After what felt like an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the fire. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I threw more wood on the fire, watching as the flames flared up, pushing back the dark. Then I saw it. A shape just at the edge of the light. Tall, still, watching. I jerked my rifle up, my hands shaking. My breath came fast, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there for the rest of the night, my back against the rock, my rifle in my lap. Morning came slow. The woods were back to normal. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Almost. I searched the ground where the figure had been.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was too deep in my own head. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day gathering wood, walking the area, trying to focus on anything except the lingering unease. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shift in the wind made me grip my rifle tighter. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The zipper on my tent. Moving. Something was outside. Something was trying to get in. I lunged for my rifle, yanked back the bolt. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, footsteps, fast, retreating into the trees. I sat there, my pulse slamming in my ears, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn was slow. I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff with tension. The air was cold, the fire just smoldering coals. Then I saw it. A single handprint on the outside of my tent. Not an animal. Not my imagination. A human handprint. It was time to leave.
I packet fast. No break fast, no lingering.
I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started walking. I moved fast, almost running. The woods felt different now, watching, waiting. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Then, after a few miles, I saw something that made my stomach turn to ice. A tree, with something carved into the bark. My name. I turned and ran. The rest of the hike was a blur. Just the pounding of my boots, the hammering of my pulse. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck just as the sun dipped below the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching. I slammed the truck into drive, tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not breathing until I hit pavement. I never went back. Started with a simple idea. Get away for a while. Life had been weighing on me, and I needed to unplug. No work, no internet, no people. Just me, some books, and the quiet of nature. I found a cabin for rent way up north, tucked deep into the woods of Minnesota. No electricity, no running water, but a working fireplace and a well outside for water. It was exactly what I wanted, off-grid, isolated, and peaceful. The drive out took nearly 5 hours, the last hour on rough dirt roads. My truck rumbled over potholes, kicking up dust as trees closed in on both sides. The further I went, the more it felt like I was leaving something behind. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I expected. A single-story structure with a porch, a tin roof, and a fire pit out front. The forest surrounded it on all sides, thick and dark. I stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was cool and still. No distant sounds of cars, no hum of power lines, just silence. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the door. The inside was basic but cozy. A fireplace, a wooden table, a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Smelled like old wood and dust. I set down my things, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The woods stretched out in front of me, endless and quiet. And then I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a woman standing just inside the treeline. She was far away, maybe 50 yards out, half hidden between the trees. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. She was wearing something dark, like a long dress or coat. Her hair was long and tangled. Even from a distance, I could tell something was off about her posture. Her arms hung stiffly at her sides, her shoulders unnaturally rigid. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought she was closer. But that was impossible. I stood up, squinting, trying to get a better look, and then she turned. Not a normal, fluid turn. Her whole body moved at once, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. Then she walked back into the woods. Not hurried, not slow, just deliberate. The second she was gone, the forest felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I told myself she was probably a hiker or some local who wandered too far from town. Maybe she hadn't even seen me, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I locked the cabin door. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsettled. I kept telling myself there was nothing to worry about. But then I woke up. It was pitch black inside the cabin. The fire had burned low, and the air was freezing, and I heard it, scratching, not on the door, on the walls, light, almost careful, like someone was running their fingers across the wood. I held my breath, heart pounding. It moved, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and rifle, my hands slick with sweat. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, barely breathing. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. There were marks on the walls. Long, thin scratches like someone had dragged fingernails across the wood. The second night, I should have left. I thought about it all day, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. That night, I built the fire high, locked every door and window, and kept my rifle close. The woods outside felt different. The air was heavy, the silence deeper. The trees seemed closer to the cabin. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, forcing myself to stay awake. Then, just after midnight, footsteps. Soft, careful, moving just beyond the porch. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then knocking. Not normal knocking. 3 slow taps. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then again. 3 taps. Then the handle turned. I raised the rifle, my pulse slamming in my ears. The door was locked, but I could hear the slow, deliberate pressure on the handle. Then, after what felt like forever silence, the air felt suffocating. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time, but they didn't go back into the woods. They went up, onto the roof. I barely slept. By the time the sun rose, I had already packed. I was leaving. I didn't care about my deposit, didn't care about anything except getting out. But my truck wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over, just a dead click. I felt my stomach drop. That's when I noticed something. On the dirt just behind my truck. Footprints. Bare. Human. Leading from the woods to the cabin. And then, just beyond the trees, she was there. Closer than before. Too close. I ran back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my rifle, checked the windows. The woods were empty again. And then I heard it. A voice. Not outside. Inside. A whisper barely there. So close to my ear it sent ice through my veins. Let me in. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, or maybe I was just too scared to process anything. I woke up hours later, sunlight pouring through the window. The footprints outside were gone. The scratches on the cabin were gone. My truck started on the first try. I didn't question it. I just left. I never looked back, never checked the mirrors. But even now, years later, I still get this feeling sometimes. Like I'm being watched. Like if I turned around at the right moment, she'd be there. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Oregon, headed for a distribution yard in Nebraska. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just interstate driving, a couple of planned fuel stops, and maybe a quick nap at a rest area if I needed it. I had been driving long haul for over a decade by then, so nothing about this trip felt unusual. I left the yard around noon, got through the mountain roads without issue, and hit the open highways by early evening. The truck was running smooth, my load was sitting right, and I had a good stretch of road ahead of me. I figured I'd push through until at least midnight before pulling over for some rest. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, but the skies were clear. Traffic was light, just a few other truckers rolling along, the occasional car passing by. I had the radio on low, sipping from a cup of coffee I had grabbed at my last stop. I was somewhere in Idaho when I saw the car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road, barely visible in the fading light. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about it seemed off. It wasn't just broken down. It looked abandoned. The hood was up, but there were no hazard lights, no signs of movement. I glanced at it as I passed. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I kept driving. Things like that happen all the time. Someone breaks down. Maybe they walk to get help. Maybe they get picked up by another driver. But something about it unsettled me. About 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same make, same model, same open door. That was when my gut started telling me something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I had driven all over the country, seen my fair share of weird things, but two abandoned cars, same type, same situation, just miles apart? That didn't sit right. I kept my speed steady, watching my mirrors, scanning the road ahead. Maybe it was some kind of coincidence, or maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Then I saw the third one. This time it was in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement. My trailer groaned under the sudden stop, the weight shifting behind me, but I kept control. The car sat there, no lights, no movement. My headlights washed over it, and that's when I noticed something else. The windshield was covered in something dark. Thick streaks like someone had smeared mud or grease across the glass. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't about to get out and check. I eased my truck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The desert stretched out on either side, nothing but open land, but something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I took a breath, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. My trailer swung slightly as I maneuvered, my eyes flicking between my mirrors and the road ahead. Once I had enough space, I cut the wheel hard and pulled back onto the highway, rolling past the abandoned car as I picked up speed. I didn't look inside, didn't want to know. The road ahead was empty. The road behind me stayed dark. I kept driving. Maybe an hour passed. I had put enough distance between me and that stretch of highway that I started to feel a little better. The night air had cooled, my rig was running smooth, and I was getting close to the state line. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, just two tiny pinpricks of light at first, but they were moving fast, too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching in my mirrors as the lights gained on me. My pulse picked up, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a car, dark colored, same make, same model. I exhaled slow, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some guy in a hurry, flying down the highway. But I knew better. The car got closer, close enough that I could see it was the same as the ones I had passed earlier. Same shape, same dark paint, moving fast but staying just behind me. Then the headlights cut out, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I kept driving. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't stopping. Another hour passed. I kept my rig steady, rolling through the night, waiting for something else to happen. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had outrun whatever this was, I saw the taillights, not far ahead, sitting in the middle of the road. A car, dark-colored, facing the wrong way. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I gritted my teeth, checked my mirrors one last time, and kept going. The car loomed closer, my headlights hitting it full force. The driver's side door was open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. A figure, just a dark shape in the glow of my high beams. I didn't see a face, didn't want to. I hit the gas. My truck roared past, my trailer rocking slightly from the air pressure, and then the car was behind me, swallowed up by the night. I didn't stop until I hit the next truck stop, a well-lit place with plenty of other rigs parked around. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. Nothing on the news, no reports of abandoned cars. Just another quiet night on the highway, but I never took that route again.